Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Now let us begin. Story 1. The Shepherd Who Found a City. You're walking along the edge of the Tiber River. The late summer sun shimmers off the sluggish, silt-filled water, and there's a breeze that carries the scent of reeds and warm dust. There's no city here, just forested hills and the occasional clearing where shepherds tend their flocks. The year is somewhere around the mid-8th century BCE, but time doesn't move quickly here. It lingers like mist along the river's edge. In this forgotten time, long before Rome would stretch across continents, there was a story told quietly in fireside murmurs and temple rituals, a story so boring, so filled with contradictory details and mythical embellishment, that most Romans accepted it without challenge. But behind that myth was a political truth, a survival story, and a city born not from glory, but from mud, murder, and necessity. The story begins with two twins, Romulus and Remus, whose names, even in antiquity, felt too convenient. Born to the Vestal virgin Rhea Silvia, daughter of Numitor, the deposed king of Alba Longa, and possibly fathered by the god Mars, though more likely by a passing soldier or a local noble, the twins were seen as a threat to the reigning king, Amulius. Amulius, eager to erase any challenges to his shaky rule, ordered the infants drowned in the Tiber. But rivers are rarely obedient. Floods had widened the banks that year, and the servant tasked with the grim act abandoned the wicker basket on a muddy shelf of riverbank rather than brave the rushing current. The basket lodged among the reeds near the base of the Palatine Hill, and here the story sharpens into the surreal. A she-wolf, Lupa, is said to have discovered the crying twins, suckling them with maternal care until a human shepherd, Faustulus, took them in. But words in Latin are slippery. Lupa also meant a prostitute. To ancient ears, this may not have been a tale of divine intervention, but of two infants rescued by a woman of the margins, a caregiver unfit for polite society but foundational to survival. Faustulus and his wife, Acca Larentia, raised the boys among the rough shepherd communities of the Roman hills. Their early lives were not tales of princely ease, but of rock-cut paths, goat milk, cold mornings, and learning which herbs wouldn't kill you when foraged. This wasn't a cradle of marble, it was one of bark and bone. At the time, the area around the Palatine and Aventine hills was a patchwork of pastoral settlements, small, clan-based communities, where law was enforced by spear and justice was an affair of families. The Tiber served as a trade route, but mostly it was a hazard. Swamps edged much of the land and disease brewed in the stagnant water. Wolves were real. Hunger was common. Romulus and Remus, if they truly lived, would have spent their youth herding, hunting, and occasionally brawling with other bands of shepherds. Leadership wasn't claimed by election or lineage, it was taken through force and held by the same. As young men, the twins allegedly began attracting a following. They were strong, clever, and most importantly, they knew how to organize. This, more than divine favor, may have been the true spark of Rome's beginnings. Eventually, the two brothers decided to found a new city near the place of their supposed salvation. But which hill would it stand upon? Romulus favored the Palatine. Remus chose the Aventine, the method of decision, augury interpreting the will of the gods through bird flight. Here the details become almost petty. Remus saw 6 vultures. Romulus claimed to see 12. The argument that followed was not about birds but about control. And so, Romulus began building walls on the Palatine. Not grand ramparts but simple, low earthen ridges, the Pomerium, an invisible boundary that was more sacred than strategic. When Remus mocked the walls and leapt over them in jest, Romulus killed him. The act was not celebrated but solemn. Romulus later claimed, "So perish anyone who crosses my walls." It was a founding myth born not of brotherhood, but of boundary and blood. Romulus became the first king not through inheritance or piety, but through elimination and consolidation. He declared Rome a place of asylum, a bold political move that would define its population. He opened the new city to outcasts, slaves, exiles, and criminals from neighboring towns. The early Romans were not aristocrats. They were survivors. In doing so, Romulus created a community not based on lineage, but on allegiance. The earliest citizens of Rome owed loyalty to the city, not to clans or noble houses. This idea, boring, bureaucratic, and utterly radical, laid the foundation for Roman identity. There was no Senate yet, no forum, no temples, but there was an army. Romulus divided the population into military units, centuries, and curiae before he built any civic institutions. Governance followed after war. It was a quiet, strategic order of operations. Establish borders, create loyalty, form a fighting force, and then negotiate from a position of strength. Every Roman king after Romulus would follow this rhythm. But there was a problem. The new city was full of men. To grow, it needed women. And so Romulus invited neighboring tribes to a festival, then abducted their daughters. The so-called rape of the Sabine women wasn't a tale of romance, but of necessity and power. Still, it's said the women later defended their Roman husbands from their angry fathers and brothers, intervening to stop a war. Whether myth or not, the message was clear. Rome expanded by absorbing others, sometimes through violence, sometimes through law. Romulus would go on to rule for many years, possibly until he disappeared in a storm and was deified. Or maybe he was assassinated by the Senate. The sources differ, and none are especially reliable. What matters is that Rome survived its first king and then replaced him with another. The Rome of Romulus was not a city of marble and virtue. It was a hilltop refuge, ringed by ditches, filled with ambition and compromise. And that humble beginning, that patchwork of criminals and shepherds, is what made the empire possible. Ending thought. If the founding of Rome was less about gods and more about strategy, what else in Roman myth hides a pragmatic truth beneath its poetic cloak? A city without roots. You can almost hear it, the shuffle of sandals across beaten earth, the faint clang of iron against wood, and the low murmur of livestock in a cramped pen. Rome, in the earliest years of Romulus's rule, was less a city and more a gathering of intentions. Tents gave way to wooden huts. Paths slowly became roads. But this was not the polished Rome of Cicero or Augustus. It was a place where decisions were made with stone tools and alliances sealed with salt and sacrifice. Romulus was not a king in the ceremonial sense. There were no royal banquets or silken robes. His authority was bound to the survival of the settlement. He functioned as war leader, judge, priest, and chief executive, all rolled into one man. But he knew he couldn't govern by brute force alone. To maintain power among a population of thieves, slaves, and wanderers, he had to invent something stronger than fear: order. The Senate, a council of elders who were young. According to tradition, Romulus appointed 100 men as advisors, elders, or paters, as they came to be known. These were not gray-bearded philosophers. Many were simply influential heads of families or clans, able to sway others with wealth, promises, or a well-placed blade. Romulus called this advisory group the Senatus, from senex, meaning old man. But in truth, many of these men were young and ambitious, with everything to gain from supporting the king's regime. The Senate held no legislative power. It existed to give advice, but Romulus could ignore it at will. Still, its existence was revolutionary. It created a precedent. Leadership could be discussed, not just enforced. This was the beginning of Roman politics, not as noble debate, but as calculated necessity. The Curiae and Curiate Assembly. Romulus divided the Roman population into 30 curiae, or wards, roughly based on kinship or locality. Each curia would vote in assemblies and participate in religious rituals. Every male citizen belonged to one. This system wasn't about democracy, it was a way to organize labor, conscript soldiers, and collect offerings. But there was genius in this tedium. These divisions gave identity to the otherwise rootless. A man might be a runaway or a freedman, but if he belonged to a curia, he was Roman. It was a civic glue, binding a chaotic mass into something functional. The Sabine crisis: marriage by force, peace by diplomacy. The women of the Sabine tribes, now unwilling brides in the new Roman settlement, soon found themselves at the center of political chaos. Their families, outraged by the abduction, raised armies and marched on Rome. Among the attackers was Titus Tatius, a Sabine king of considerable force. What followed was more than a skirmish. The Sabines gained access to the Roman citadel on the Capitoline Hill, allegedly through the betrayal of Tarpeia, a Roman maiden who offered to open the gates. Her story is a cautionary tale in Roman lore. She asked for what the Sabines wore on their left arms, hopping for golden bracelets, but was crushed under their shields instead. The battle between Romans and Sabines dragged on. Blood stained the hills. But in a scene recounted by generations of Roman historians, the Sabine women, the very ones stolen, ran between the clashing armies. With children in one arm and raised hands in the other, they pleaded for an end to the fighting. A truce was struck. Romulus and Titus Tatius would rule together as joint kings. The Sabines and Romans merged into one people, and with this, the city expanded not through destruction, but through incorporation. Rome would follow this model repeatedly in its future. Enemies turned into citizens. Religious foundations, boring but sacred. For a society built on pragmatic violence, Rome was also deeply religious, but its rituals were rooted in routine rather than ecstasy. Romulus established priesthoods and inaugurated cults that revolved around maintaining the favor of the gods through procedure. He created the role of the pontifex, a priest who maintained records of omens, calendars, and sacred rites. The augurs, priests skilled in reading the flight of birds or the entrails of sacrificed animals, were consulted before every important action. Romulus understood that for his rule to be legitimate, it had to appear divinely sanctioned. Even decisions about when to go to war were made with the consultation of sacred chickens. This fusion of religion with governance wasn't about faith, it was about legitimacy. To question Romulus was to question the gods. Rome's first military campaigns: order through violence. As king, Romulus led multiple campaigns against neighboring peoples: Veii, Fidenae, the Etruscans. These were not grand wars, but raids and retaliatory expeditions. Their purpose was not to conquer vast territory, but to show strength and seize supplies. Each victory served a bureaucratic purpose. Land was distributed to the growing population. Prisoners were offered citizenship or used as forced labor. Temples were built with the spoils of war. After one such victory, Romulus instituted a new tradition: the spolia opima, the richest spoils taken from an enemy leader slain in single combat. This, too, was more ritual than reality, but it tied military achievement directly to divine favor. The early Roman army was not professional. It was made of citizens, each supplying his own arms. Romulus structured it into centuries, groups of 100 men, though the actual size varied. It was a reflection of his governance, part organization, part improvisation. Death or disappearance, the mystery of Romulus's end. Romulus's rule, though often glorified, ended in uncertainty. One version of his death tells of a storm during a military review. As thunder cracked and darkness fell, Romulus vanished. His body was never found. Later accounts say the Senate murdered him, cutting him into pieces and hiding his remains under their robes, then blaming the gods for his disappearance. To resolve the ambiguity, a man named Julius Proculus claimed Romulus had appeared to him in a dream, declaring he had ascended to the heavens and become the god Quirinus. This story soothed the populace and allowed for orderly succession. It was Rome's first peaceful regime change. What mattered was not the truth of his fate, but the order it preserved. Romulus's legacy: boundaries, brotherhood, and blood. Romulus laid the foundations of Roman identity in ways that would last centuries. Walls before temples, security preceded culture. People over purity. Rome grew by absorbing outsiders, not excluding them. Myth woven with law. Every institution had a divine origin, whether real or invented. Power shared when convenient. Titus Tatius ruled alongside Romulus, but only until his convenient death. The city that emerged by the end of Romulus's reign was still small. Its population numbered in the thousands. Its buildings were wooden, its streets muddy. But it had something no other city in the region possessed: a system that turned strangers into citizens. Ending thought. If Rome began as a haven for outcasts, and its first king vanished into myth, how did the next ruler reconcile sacred tradition with political reality? And why did the Romans choose a priest rather than a warrior? A city in mourning, a kingdom in limbo. After the mysterious disappearance or assassination of Romulus, the city he had founded stood at a crossroads. There was no constitution, no written law, and no agreed-upon way to choose a new leader. For a time, Rome had no king. The people waited. This interregnum, as Roman historians later called it, was a moment of delicate uncertainty. Rome was still a fragile, newly unified cluster of settlers, former enemies, and wanderers. Without leadership, it risked splintering back into the petty hills and warring tribes from which it had emerged. But what followed was not chaos, it was careful experimentation. The interregnum, governance by rotation. In the absence of a king, Rome's Senate, composed of the 100 elders Romulus had originally appointed, took the reins. But rather than one senator claiming kingship, the body instituted a rotating system. Each senator would hold power for 5 days, as interrex literally, between kings. This rotation continued for nearly a year. The interreges maintained order, heard petitions, and perhaps most importantly, debated what kind of ruler should follow Romulus. This was the first glimpse of Roman political culture: an aversion to concentrated power, a reverence for ritual, and a preference for slow, consultative decision-making even in times of potential crisis. Eventually, the Senate settled on a consensus. The next king would not be chosen from among the Romans. A king from beyond, the selection of Numa Pompilius. The man they chose was Numa Pompilius, a Sabine. This was a significant gesture. By selecting a non-Roman as their second king, the Senate reinforced the new city's dual heritage. Romulus had fused the Sabines and Romans by marriage and politics. Numa would symbolize their equal stake in the future. Numa was known for his wisdom, calm temperament, and deep religious piety. He was said to live in the countryside, in quiet contemplation, uninterested in power. When approached with the offer of kingship, Numa reportedly declined. It took persuasion by ambassadors, priests, and possibly an augur's reading of birds to convince him. Eventually, he agreed. Numa arrived in Rome not as a conqueror, but as a philosopher king, a model completely unlike Romulus. His reign would define a different side of Roman identity, not the military and political might of the sword, but the sacred order of law, calendar, and ritual. The Sabine philosophy of rule. Numa's refusal to take power by force was not weakness, it was a deliberate cultural message. He would not build Rome by expanding its territory, but by organizing its spirit. The city, still young, needed not more victories, but a framework for meaning. Under Numa, the pomp of ceremony began to take root. Temples were founded not simply as offerings to the gods, but as centers of social cohesion. He reportedly closed the city's gates of war, the Janus Geminus, a small shrine whose doors were kept open during wartime and shut during peace. Numa kept those doors closed for his entire reign. For decades, Rome knew no major wars. But Numa's true legacy would be in the quiet details, those easily overlooked, but essential to Roman civic life. The foundation of religious offices. Where Romulus had built armies, Numa built institutions. He established the major religious colleges of Rome. The pontifices, responsible for overseeing rituals, keeping the religious calendar, and regulating sacred law. The augurs, who interpreted omens from the gods, particularly from birds, lightning, and natural signs. The flamens, individual priests dedicated to specific gods, most notably Flamen Diales, the high priest of Jupiter. The Vestal Virgins, priestesses who maintained the sacred fire of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, and were tasked with preserving the spiritual integrity of the city. These roles would survive for centuries, embedded deep into the Roman state's DNA. The Republic and Empire would later be filled with senators and emperors who had, at some point, served as augurs, flamens, or pontifices. Numa gave Rome a second skeleton where Romulus had built the body. Numa formed the soul. The Roman calendar, time as a civic duty. One of Numa's most significant but least glamorous reforms was the restructuring of the calendar. Under Romulus, the Roman calendar had only 10 months, beginning in March Martius and ending in December. It left a confusing, unaccounted-for winter gap. Numa added Januarius and Februarius, named for the god Janus and the festival of purification, respectively. This reform was about more than counting days. It brought order to civic and religious life. Festivals, elections, military campaigns, and even contracts depended on a common calendar. By defining the year, Numa defined public time. Time itself became a tool of the state. The calendar was governed by priests, and every addition or delay was determined by omens and rituals. This, too, placed power into the hands of structured, predictable institutions. Laws without weapons, the civic ideal. Under Numa, the laws of Rome began to reflect a moral and spiritual order. These weren't laws as we think of them, codified statutes and written decrees, but ritual customs and sacred prohibitions. He introduced the Fetial laws, a set of procedures for declaring war. Before hostilities could begin, a priestly envoy had to formally demand restitution, and only after 33 days of silence or refusal could Rome consider war just. These rituals gave Rome a sense of moral high ground, even if they were often formalities. The kingship under Numa was an act of constant negotiation between the divine and the human. He ruled not by fiat, but through precedent, omen, and process. The myth of Egeria, divine counsel in the forest. To explain Numa's wisdom, later Romans claimed he was guided by a divine nymph named Egeria, who lived in a sacred grove near Rome. According to legend, she whispered laws and advice to him at night, helping him devise Rome's religious structure. The image is poetic, a king kneeling in silence, listening to the voice of the divine through the rustling of trees. Whether Egeria was a real cult figure, a metaphor for private counsel, or simply myth, she symbolized something vital. Roman law and tradition were seen not just as human agreements, but as sacred inheritances. Even the dullest temple regulation had, supposedly, divine origins. Death and legacy of Numa. After a reign of 43 years, an astonishing length for the era, Numa Pompilius died. His passing was not marked by civil unrest or invasion. The peace he preserved was not only external, but internal. Rome had become a city not only with boundaries, but with identity. He was buried with his sacred books, or so legend says. Later, when his tomb was supposedly rediscovered centuries afterward, the books were said to contain arcane religious knowledge. They were reportedly burned by order of the Senate, either for being too dangerous, too foreign, or too un-Roman in origin. No one quite agrees. But the story underscores a strange paradox in Roman culture: reverence for tradition and suspicion of those who claim to know too much of its roots. Romulus and Numa, two halves of a Roman whole. Together, Romulus and Numa Pompilius formed the archetype of Roman kingship, one rooted in force and foundation, the other in peace and procedure. Later Romans would look back on them as complementary opposites: the sword and the scroll, the wolf and the flame. Numa's reign taught Rome that true power could lie in repetition, ritual, and restraint. He took a city of warriors and taught them to honor silence, patience, and rhythm. The impact of Numa's reign cannot be overstated. Religious institutions structured Roman society. Time itself was now a state function. Peace was recognized as a choice, not a weakness. Final reflection: if Rome's first king ruled by strength and its second by sacred tradition, what would happen when a king attempted both only to be consumed by ambition? Story 2: Walls of Mud and Willpower. A city without stone. Picture Rome in its early years, not the metropolis of emperors, but a sprawl of timber huts and animal pens along the muddy bends of the Tiber. There are no marble facades, no triumphal arches. Only wet soil, bark-thatched roofs, and footpaths pressed hard by the boots of shepherds, soldiers, and citizens. This is a city that should not have survived. It lay vulnerable between rival tribes, lacked access to coastal trade, and struggled with flooding and disease. Its only constant was movement of livestock, of migrants, and of ambition. But it was precisely that vulnerability that led to one of its earliest and most overlooked achievements: its first walls. And those walls, they were not made of grandeur. They were made of mud, sweat, ritual, and fear. Before the walls, vulnerable beginnings. In the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, the Italian landscape was a patchwork of competing hilltop settlements, tribal confederations, and small fortified towns. These were not yet cities in the modern sense, but they were fiercely independent. Rome sat at a disadvantage. Nestled between the Etruscans to the north and the Latins and Sabines to the east, its hilltop communities were relatively exposed. Though the Palatine, Aventine, and Capitoline hills offered natural defensive benefits, the city was an open invitation to raiders. The Tiber River, while useful for trade and movement, also allowed enemies easy access via boat. And the swampy valleys between the hills, particularly the later Forum area, were breeding grounds for disease and hindered fast troop movements. With Romulus and later kings, Rome slowly began to unite its hills under one identity. But defense required more than shared language or customs. It required boundaries. The earthen rampart, the Murus Romuli. According to legend, Romulus himself began the process of fortification when he traced a sacred boundary pomerium around the Palatine Hill. This wasn't just symbolic. Archaeological evidence suggests that early Rome did, in fact, construct a low earthen wall, reinforced with timber palisades and a ditch, likely around the 7th century BCE. This Murus Romuli, or Wall of Romulus, was not a wall as we think of one. It was a series of embankments, raised earthworks made from soil dug from defensive trenches. These were quick to build, easy to maintain, and served more as psychological deterrents than actual barricades. The ditch fossa was often more important than the wall. A deep, sloped trench filled with water or sharpened stakes could disrupt cavalry and funnel attackers into predictable paths. These defenses were also easier to expand than stone, allowing Rome to adapt its boundaries as its population grew. Material realities: why mud mattered. Mud was not a sign of poverty, it was an intelligent choice. Rome lacked nearby high-quality stone quarries at the time. Timber and clay were abundant. Early Roman builders mixed soil with straw and water to create wattle and daub, or even rammed earth sections for walls, occasionally reinforced with logs. These materials dried quickly in summer, could be reshaped or repaired after rains, and were fire-resistant when treated with lime or ash. They absorbed the shock of rams better than brittle stone, though they needed regular maintenance. The fortifications were built with community labor, not professional soldiers or slaves. These projects often had religious significance. Each section might be consecrated to a deity, with boundary stones, sipi, marked and guarded by taboos. Violating a sacred wall wasn't just a civic offense, it was a sin. Fortification as identity. More than protection, Rome's walls defined who belonged inside and who stayed out. They created a concept of us and them that Rome would export for centuries. Inside the walls, you were part of the civitas. Outside, you were a stranger, a guest, or a threat. The building of walls was not only a defensive act, it was a political and psychological one. In many Roman religious traditions, walls weren't to be crossed casually. A general could not bring his army into the Pomerium without laying down his command. Weapons were banned inside sacred boundaries. Even returning victors celebrated their triumphs outside the city before being granted special dispensation to enter. Thus, the early walls laid not just physical defenses but moral architecture, shaping Roman thought for centuries to come. Learning from the Etruscans. By the late 7th century BCE, Rome began to absorb cultural and technological influences from its powerful northern neighbors, the Etruscans. These sophisticated city builders had long mastered defensive architecture. Etruscan towns like Veii and Tarquinia were fortified with massive stone walls, including gates with corbelled arches, a precursor to later Roman engineering. Their walls combined tuff, a volcanic stone that was abundant in central Italy, with more advanced tools and techniques for masonry. Rome would eventually imitate these designs, but at this early stage, what mattered more was what Rome observed than what it copied. Through interaction and trade, Rome learned about urban planning, drainage, and boundary control. These were not grand revelations. They were small, practical insights. How to slope a ditch so it didn't collapse in rain, how to redirect floodwater, how to embed stakes to deter infantry. Yet these quiet innovations made the difference between a settlement and a city-state. The sacred and the strategic, fortification rituals. When new walls were built or extended, the process was ritualized. A priest would lead an ox and a sow around the proposed line, plowing a shallow furrow to mark the future perimeter. The animals would then be sacrificed. The gods needed to approve of the boundaries, and the land needed to be purified. Breaking a sacred wall, even during construction, was grounds for punishment. This blend of superstition and strategy reinforced the sanctity of the city's borders. Rome wasn't unique in this. Similar rituals occurred in Greece and Mesopotamia. But Rome's blending of military logic and spiritual ceremony gave its walls an enduring symbolic power. Even during the empire, emperors would trace new Pomeria when expanding the city. Boundaries, once established, were not merely fences, they were foundations of faith. Not just against people, walls versus nature. Early Roman walls also served as protection from the environment. Flooding from the Tiber was a frequent danger. The city's location, in a low basin surrounded by hills, created drainage challenges. Walls helped contain runoff, redirect erosion, and provide elevated platforms for critical buildings. They were often paired with drainage ditches and early versions of culverts. One of the most famous outcomes of this effort was the later Cloaca Maxima, the Great Sewer, which began as a simple drainage canal. This aspect of Roman walls is often overlooked. Their dual purpose as barrier and channel, as much for nature as for war. A fortress of the mind. By 600 BCE, Rome had fortified most of the Palatine and Capitoline hills. These walls were modest, no towering stone battlements, no elaborate towers, but they worked. They bought time. They gave the city the appearance of permanence. They turned a collection of hills into a singular identity. Even more importantly, they taught the Romans a basic truth that would guide their empire. If you build the right boundary, people will fight to defend it. Ending thought. If Rome's earliest walls were made of mud and ritual more than strength, how did later kings, particularly those with foreign origins, transform Rome's defenses from sacred mounds to monumental architecture? From mud to masonry. By the early 6th century BCE, Rome stood at a historical inflection point. The city was still young, its architecture still simple, its defenses humble, but power was consolidating. Trade networks were forming, and atop the Palatine and Capitoline hills, new leaders were thinking beyond survival, they were imagining legacy. Enter Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, the fifth king of Rome. He was not Roman by birth. In fact, he wasn't even Latin. He was Etruscan, a descendant of Greek immigrants who had settled in the wealthy and powerful Etruscan city of Tarquinii. Tarquinius would become the first king to truly transform Rome from a fortified refuge into a structured, walled urban center. And his contributions to its early defensive infrastructure, though often overlooked, were foundational. He was the king who began to replace ritual dirt with cut stone. An immigrant's path to power. The story of Tarquinius is often romanticized. Born to a wealthy Greek father and Etruscan mother, he moved to Rome seeking opportunity. There, he reportedly gained the favor of King Ancus Marcius, Romulus's fourth successor. Tarquinius was adopted almost informally into Roman elite life, rising through service and political skill. When Ancus died, Tarquinius used both personal influence and public maneuvering to secure the kingship, an early example of Rome's flexible but persuasive monarchical transitions. Tarquinius did not waste time. His vision was to make Rome not just secure, but imposing. Defenses by design, the beginnings of stone fortification. Tarquinius understood something many Romans had yet to grasp. Image mattered. Rome had walls, yes, but they were uneven, humble, and mostly of packed earth or wooden palisades. They kept people out, but they didn't inspire fear or respect. Drawing from Etruscan city building models, Tarquinius initiated projects that would reshape Rome's skyline. While records are unclear, he is likely the first Roman king to introduce tufa stone, a soft, volcanic rock abundant in central Italy, into the construction of city defenses. Tufa could be cut into blocks, allowing for more regular walls. It hardened with exposure to air and could support greater weight. With it, Rome could begin building permanent ramparts. These early stone walls were laid in opus quadratum, a simple rectangular block style. While primitive by later standards, they marked a revolutionary step for Rome, from temporary defenses to monumental intent. The influence of Etruscan engineering. Tarquinius also brought with him a cultural memory of Etruscan military architecture. The cities of Veii, Servitory, and Clusium had formidable walls, multi-gated, bastioned, and integrated with religious space. Rome had none of these. Tarquinius began to change that. He likely initiated work on gate complexes, where roads entering the city passed through controlled points, places where commerce could be taxed and enemies delayed. While we lack detailed architectural evidence of his specific contributions, later Roman writers attribute to him the foundation of Rome's gate system, including the early Porta Mugonia and Porta Saturnia. These weren't yet mighty arches, but they created something vital, a controlled border. The Servian Wall, a vision begins. Though it would later be attributed to Servius Tullius, the sixth king, the earliest phases of what became the Servian Wall may have started under Tarquinius Priscus. This wall would eventually encompass a much larger Rome, nearly 11 kilometers in circumference, enclosing all 7 hills. It would later feature towers, battlements, and multiple gates. But in its infancy, It began as a series of disconnected reinforcements. Embankments reinforced with stone, foundations laid for future extensions, and the training of a labor force capable of working stone at scale. Under Tarquinius, Rome began organizing military labor, including enslaved captives, citizens, and artisans, to build for defense and ceremony alike. This was also the era of large-scale land surveying, where boundaries were not just sacred, but mapped. Drainage and defense, the Cloaca Maxima. No discussion of Tarquinius's contribution to Roman walls would be complete without mentioning his role in drainage engineering. The Cloaca Maxima, one of Rome's oldest and most enduring engineering feats, began under his rule. This massive drainage canal channeled runoff from the Forum Valley and surrounding lowlands into the Tiber, drying land that would become the heart of the city. But its role was more than sanitary. By redirecting water, the cloaca made defensive building feasible. Foundations no longer collapsed in swampy soil. Walls no longer sank into mud. Structures could be built higher, and ground near the Tiber could be patrolled and reinforced. What began as an effort to tame water also enabled fortification. A temple and a signal. Tarquinius's grandest architectural ambition was the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill. While not a wall, this massive religious complex founded during his reign and completed by his successors functioned as a symbolic bulwark. It sat atop the most defensible hill in Rome, visible for miles. Its construction required leveling the Capitoline's summit, an engineering feat that simultaneously reinforced the city's spiritual center and its physical high ground. The temple was wrapped in terraced embankments, retaining walls and substructures designed to manage erosion and attack. It was a defensive sacred hybrid, blending Rome's military posture with divine patronage. Building this temple was, in effect, declaring, "We are here to stay." Walls within walls, Rome's internal fortifications. Tarquinius may also have supported internal walling, smaller enclosures within the city that separated districts, stored weapons, or marked elite compounds. These served both security and administrative purposes. The Forum Boarium, Rome's cattle market near the Tiber, was likely walled off at some point in this era. Markets were a weak point in any city's defense, and surrounding them with stone and patrol routes was a sensible precaution. Early military storehouses, called horia, may have also been protected with stone. These were not grand buildings, but they held grain, weapons, and wealth, the lifeblood of a growing city. Labor, law, and class. Of course, these projects required labor often hard, repetitive, and dangerous. Tarquinius organized Rome's lower classes and enslaved people into work crews. The idea of the state assigning labor was foreign to earlier Romans, but under Tarquinius, it became normalized. He may have initiated the first census, a move later formalized by Servius Tullius. With population data, the city could levy manpower and track contributions essential for coordinated construction. This laid the groundwork for a state-based infrastructure model, one that combined taxation, civic duty, and sacred purpose. In a society without a written constitution, the very act of participating in wall building was a civic ritual. Tarquinius's legacy of stone. Tarquinius's reign ended, like many Roman monarchs, with intrigue and violence. Yet his legacy remained rooted literally in the stone foundations beneath the later Republic. He transformed Rome from a collection of tribal enclaves into a unified walled space. And while the city's future walls would expand and improve, his reign proved a vital truth. Rome could think like an empire long before it became one. Ending thought. If Tarquinius Priscus turned earth to stone and ritual to engineering, what would happen when his successor sought to measure, tax, and classify every Roman citizen, reducing people to numbers for the sake of control? an inheritance of stone and strategy. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus may have introduced stone to Rome's fortifications, but it was Servius Tullius, the sixth king of Rome, who completed their transformation into a statement of power, policy, and permanence. His rule represents a turning point in Roman history not merely because of what he built, but because of why he built it. Where earlier kings erected walls to keep enemies out, Servius used walls to count, to classify, and ultimately to control. His name is forever attached to Rome's first comprehensive stone defensive wall, the so-called Servian Wall, even if it would later be expanded and rebuilt. But more than a wall, it was a monument to bureaucracy. Servius Tullius, a king of ambiguous origin. The rise of Servius is itself a study in social boundaries. Roman legend paints him as a man of low birth, perhaps even a former slave, or at least the child of one. Some accounts say he was born in the royal household, others that his mother was a captured Latin princess. Whatever the truth, Servius rose through the palace under the patronage of Queen Tanaquil, wife of the deceased Tarquinius Priscus. It was Tanaquil who, when her husband was assassinated, declared Servius the acting regent. He seized power not by war or election, but by the vacuum of protocol, a pattern that would reappear throughout Roman political history. Servius was a king made not by conquest but by circumstance. And yet, what he lacked in nobility, he made up for in administration. The Servian Wall, fact and myth. The wall that bears Servius's name was a massive undertaking. It was the first truly comprehensive city wall, designed to enclose not just one or two hills, but all seven: the Palatine, Aventine, Caelian, Esquiline, Quirinal, Viminal, and Capitoline. Its circumference stretched over 11 kilometers, about 7 miles, a monumental size for its time. Constructed largely of tufa, a porous volcanic stone quarried from the nearby Alban Hills, the wall stood between 3.6 and 4 meters high, 12 to 13 feet, and in some places over 3.5 meters thick. It included over a dozen gates, each controlling vital roads and trade routes leading into the city. Many of these gates would remain for centuries, serving both defense and commerce: Porta Caepna, Porta Collina, Porta Esquilina, among others. This was no longer a wall of defense alone, it was a border of identity, a signal to the world that Rome was no longer a scattering of hill tribes. It was a unified city-state, defended not just by stone, but by systems. The census, walling in the people. But Servius's true genius was not the wall itself, it was what the wall enabled. For the first time, Rome had clear boundaries, and with those boundaries came the opportunity to count. Servius conducted the first Roman census, a citywide enumeration of the population. The census was not a neutral record. It was a tool for dividing citizens into classes based on wealth and property. These classes would determine military obligation, voting power, and social standing. This was a quiet revolution. For the first time, political power in Rome was tied to land and wealth, not just lineage. The 5 classes and their soldiers. Servius divided Roman citizens into 5 classes, each with subcategories, according to their holdings in land, livestock, and income. Each class had to contribute a specified number of soldiers to the Roman army. The first class provided full armor and cavalry. The second and third offered infantry with partial armor. The fourth bore only shields and javelins. The fifth were light troops, often without armor at all. Below them were the proletarii, those too poor to contribute arms, who were exempt from service but also had minimal political representation. The census was repeated every 5 years. Over time, it became the foundation of Rome's comitia centuriata, or centuriate assembly, where citizens voted by class and thus, wealthier Romans held more votes and influence. Walls as dividers within the city. The Servian wall was not merely a perimeter, it enabled internal classification. Within the walls, Rome was subdivided into 4 urban regions, each tied to religious, military, and political functions. Servius also extended the Pomerium, the sacred boundary of the city, further than ever before. This redefinition allowed for expansion of civic and religious rituals, and clarified who was within the Roman state and who remained outside it. Even religious roles began to reflect geography. Where you lived in relation to the wall influenced your identity, your taxes, and even your eligibility for public office. This was Rome's first formal zoning, a concept that would echo in modern cities thousands of years later. Fortified roads and statecraft. Servius also began fortifying and standardizing roads leading into and out of Rome, further connecting the new gates to distant towns and trade routes. These roads were extensions of Roman control, both militarily and economically. By connecting Rome to Latin League cities, the Sabines, and beyond, Servius ensured that the wall was not an end, but a hub. Movement through gates could be taxed, restricted, or monitored. The city could now control what came in and what went out. It was, in a sense, a wall that turned Rome from an open village into a node of empire. A king overthrown by his own wall. Despite his organizational brilliance, Servius Tullius's reign ended in violence. His daughter, Tullia, and her husband, Tarquinius Superbus, the Proud, conspired to murder him and seize the throne. In a legendary scene, Tullia is said to have driven her chariot over her father's body in the Vicus Celeratus, the street of infamy. The moral here is stark. Classification breeds ambition. The same system Servius created to give structure to Rome allowed others to manipulate and betray it. His wall remained, but the values it embodied were no longer sacred. The dual nature of boundaries. With the completion of the Servian wall, Rome was no longer a city of happenstance. It had limits, it had institutions, and it had hierarchies. The wall wasn't just a physical barrier, it was a metaphorical one too. It marked the divide between citizen and non-citizen, between obligation and privilege, between public and private. Servius may have believed he was bringing order, but order can be weaponized, and in Rome, it often was. Echoes across centuries. The Servian wall would survive for hundreds of years, even as the Republic grew and the empire expanded beyond it. It was damaged during the Gallic sack in 390 BCE, repaired, expanded, and eventually supplanted by the Aurelian Wall centuries later. But its core purpose, defining Rome, organizing it, and defending it, remained central to the Roman psyche. Roman generals would later replicate its logic across the empire, from Hadrian's Wall in Britain to Lyme's fortifications in Germany. Walls were no longer just to repel enemies, they were tools of order, control, and identity. And it all began with Servius Tullius, who realized that before Rome could master the world, it had to know who it was and count them. Final reflection. If Servius used walls to define citizenship, wealth, and power, what happens when kings start treating walls as symbols of personal grandeur rather than civic duty? Could pride, once encircled by stone, be the very thing that breaks a city's unity? A king who refused to rule with the sword. You find yourself in early Rome again, but it's quieter now. The clang of arms has been replaced by chanting. The smoke of sacrifice curls skyward from crude stone altars. There is no war. There is no conquering. There is only the daily rhythm of rituals, the placement of stones in sacred order, the watching of birds, the reading of signs. This is the Rome of Numa Pompilius, the city's second king, and perhaps its most reluctant. Numa was not a founder or a fighter. He was, instead, a philosopher, a ritualist, and, in the eyes of many Romans, a bridge between the divine and the daily. Where Romulus gave Rome its boundaries, Numa gave it its breath, the slow, sacred pulse of time and law. His reign is often told in half-whispers, filled with gods, groves, and gentle reforms. And yet, beneath that spiritual calm was a radical idea, that a society, especially a new one, could be governed by discipline and ritual, rather than dominance and fear. The reluctant ruler. According to tradition, after Romulus disappeared or was murdered, depending on which historian you believe, Rome entered an interregnum, a year-long period in which different senators held temporary power in 5-day rotations. This experiment in collective governance revealed something fundamental. The Romans preferred kings. The Senate had structure, but no charisma. The people wanted continuity. They needed a leader to represent both authority and divine favor. Eventually, the Roman people chose to reach outside their own kind. They turned to Cures, a Sabine town, and selected a man known for wisdom and religious devotion, Numa Pompilius. Numa refused at first. It said that he had no interest in rule, preferring to live in the countryside, offering quiet sacrifices to unknown gods. But like many rulers in Roman lore, his ascension was painted as fate. Omens were read, signs were given, and finally he accepted. What followed was not a reign of conquest, but of construction of the invisible. Rome without war, a radical experiment. For 43 years, Numa ruled without engaging in a single war. To a Roman ear, this was astonishing. Later historians struggled to understand how a city founded in violence could survive in peace. But Numa's goal was not expansion, it was consolidation of identity. He sought to make Rome a place where the gods were respected, the calendar was known, and every citizen had a place within sacred order. He closed the gates of the Temple of Janus, symbolic doors that remained open during war and closed during peace. During his entire reign, they stayed shut. The people came to believe that only when the gods were properly honored would the city prosper, creating a sacred bureaucracy. Numa's greatest legacy may be in the realm of religious institutions. He established priesthoods, rituals, and religious offices that would endure throughout the Republic and Empire. This wasn't just piety, it was policy. He understood that rituals could regulate behavior, calendar could structure time, and sacred duties could unify tribes. Among the offices and orders he established: pontifices. These priests oversaw public religious duties, rituals, and festivals. They also maintained the calendar and recorded sacred laws. Augurs, specialists in reading divine will from natural signs, particularly the flight of birds. No important state action could occur without augural approval. Flamines, priests dedicated to individual gods, particularly Jupiter, Mars, and Quirinus, a deified version of Romulus. Vestal virgins, priestesses of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, tasked with maintaining Rome's sacred fire. Their purity was symbolic of the city's continuity and well-being. Each of these roles came with rules, attire, taboos, and authority, and each embedded sacred observance into the bones of the city's governance. Time itself becomes sacred, the Roman calendar. Numa reformed the Roman calendar, which had previously included only 10 months, beginning in March and ending in December. He added January, Januarius, and February, Februarius months dedicated to Janus, the god of transitions, and Februa, the festival of purification. This wasn't just about aligning dates, it was about creating sacred rhythms. Festivals, planting cycles, legal terms, and tax periods all depended on time being measured and ordered. Numa also introduced intercalary months, inserted as needed by priestly decree to maintain alignment with the lunar cycle. This put the pontifices in a powerful position. Those who controlled the calendar could effectively delay or advance laws and elections. Egeria and the Divine Council. According to legend, Numa was not acting alone. He received nightly counsel from a nymph named Egeria, who lived in a sacred grove outside the city. She whispered divine knowledge to him, helping him create Rome's religious structure. Whether Egeria was a real cult figure, a metaphor for intuition, or a later invention, she served to validate Numa's authority without the need for conquest. A king didn't need to carry a sword if the gods themselves spoke to him. In many ways, Egeria embodied the idea that wisdom could be revealed, not taking a distinctly non-Roman notion in later centuries, but one that suited this quiet, formative era. Law through oath, not fear. Numa's legal reforms focused on binding citizens through oaths and rituals, rather than penalties and prisons. Disputes were settled by religious arbitration. Contracts were sanctified by invoking the gods. Perjury was not just dishonorable, it was dangerous. This approach created a sense that every civic action had cosmic consequences. A man didn't just owe loyalty to his city, he owed it to the universe's order. Temples and spaces, sacred geography. While Numa did not build temples on the scale of later kings, he mapped out sacred spaces. He defined groves, shrines, and altars for newly established cults. One of his most enduring creations was the Temple of Janus, which would stand near the Roman Forum. His reign also saw the formal development of the Pomerium, the sacred boundary of Rome. Numa reinforced the idea that this invisible line defined not just space, but jurisdiction. Certain laws applied only inside the Pomerium. Military power, for example, was suspended within it, an idea that would later define republican governance. This layering of spiritual geography onto civic space was one of Numa's most subtle legacies. To walk through Rome was to move through zones of divine attention. A legacy etched in silence. Numa died peacefully and was buried with his sacred books. Legend says that centuries later, his tomb was unearthed and his books containing secret rituals and divine knowledge were found still intact. But they were burned by the Senate. Some say it was because they were too foreign, others because they were too dangerous. Perhaps the real reason was simpler. Numa's reign had come to symbolize a different Rome, one where power flowed from peace. And by the time those books resurfaced, Rome no longer wanted to remember that version of itself. The priest-king model. Numa Pompilius was not the last king of Rome, but he was the only one remembered purely for restraint. Where others built armies, he built ritual offices. Where others expanded territory, he expanded ceremony. Where others measured success in conquest, he measured it in harmony with the gods. His Rome was small, quiet, structured, yet it endured. It taught the Romans an early lesson. Peace is not the absence of war, but the presence of order. And sometimes, discipline without violence is the most radical power of all. Ending thought. If Numa showed that divine law could govern a city more powerfully than the sword, what happens when kings claim both the gods and the armies, blending piety with personal ambition? The architecture of ritual. Rome, under Numa Pompilius, was not growing in land or population, it was growing in ritual complexity. Every act, from planting seeds to making treaties, now required some gesture toward the gods. These rituals were not optional, they were obligations built into the very structure of the city. Numa was not merely a king. He was a ritual engineer, shaping the spiritual foundations that would allow future kings and citizens to trust in something larger than the sword. And through these sacred systems, he introduced the idea that Rome was not just ruled, it was blessed. But Numa's greatest invention wasn't any single festival, shrine, or office. It was the interconnectedness of everything. Ritual didn't sit on the edge of Roman life, it became the invisible net that caught all action, decision, and even time itself. The rise of the pontifices. One of Numa's most important legacies was the creation of the Pontifical College, headed by the Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of Rome. The word pontifex is thought to mean bridge builder, possibly signifying a bridge between gods and men, or between the realms of ritual and civic life. The pontifices were entrusted with maintaining the sacred calendar, supervising state religious rituals, recording prodigies and omens, ensuring festivals were properly conducted, regulating intercalation, or the insertion of days or months to realign the calendar with the lunar cycle. In essence, they controlled time itself. A poorly kept calendar could delay elections, shorten or extend terms, or cause citizens to miss vital religious observances. Later, during the Republic, the manipulation of the calendar became a political weapon. But Numa's intent was far from manipulative. His goal was to harmonize civic and divine rhythms. Festivals coincided with planting, harvest, military rest periods, and public ceremonies. The pontifices didn't just keep time, they ensured Rome moved with the will of the gods. Augury and the language of the sky. Another of Numa's key creations was the Collegium Augurum, a priesthood dedicated to interpreting the gods' will through natural signs, especially the flight of birds, auspicia. To modern ears, this sounds quaint, but to Romans, no political or military action could be taken without proper auspices. An election, battle, treaty, or even the founding of a colony required divine permission. Augurs used rods, lidus, to divide the sky into sacred quadrants, observing birds' direction, number, and species. If the signs were inauspicious, the planned action was delayed, postponed, or abandoned. This wasn't mere superstition, it was a sophisticated method of political delay and control. Future magistrates and generals would use augury to influence Senate decisions, justify failures, or claim divine approval for aggressive moves. Numa institutionalized doubt and reflection, embedding them into Rome's most critical moments. Flamines and the domestication of the divine. While augurs interpreted divine will, the flamines served as the daily caretakers of Rome's most important gods. Numa created 3 chief flamines: Flamen Diales, priest of Jupiter; Flamen Martiales, priest of Mars; Flamen Quirinales, priest of Quirinus, the deified Romulus. These priests lived highly regulated lives, bound by dozens of rules and taboos. For example, the Flamen Diales could not touch metal, see a corpse, or sleep outside his bed for more than 3 nights. He had to wear specific clothing, avoid knots, and refrain from riding a horse. These restrictions seem excessive, but they served a function: ritual purity. These men were symbols of uninterrupted connection to their deities. They were Rome's spiritual infrastructure. The Flamines didn't lead armies. They didn't build roads, but their presence ensured that Rome itself remained sacred. The Vestal Virgins and the fire of continuity. Among Numa's boldest reforms was the introduction of the Vestal Virgins, a group of 6 priestesses charged with maintaining the eternal flame of Vesta, goddess of the hearth. Chosen between the ages of 6 and 10, the Vestals took a 30-year vow of chastity. Their role was to guard the sacred flame in the Temple of Vesta, believed to symbolize Rome's eternal life. Their duties were not merely ceremonial. Vestals had legal privileges rare for Roman women. They could own property, make wills, and were protected from harm under penalty of death. But with honor came risk. If the sacred flame went out, it signaled divine displeasure. If a Vestal broke her vow, she was buried alive in a ritual execution. This fusion of purity, discipline, and death reflected a core Roman belief. Survival depended on unbroken ritual. Numa's Vestals weren't just priestesses. They were living embodiments of Rome's sacred resilience. Sacred law as social order. Rather than issue laws carved in stone, Numa codified ritual conduct: how citizens should behave during festivals, sacrifices, or in sacred spaces. These customs were not enforced by punishment so much as by social expectation and divine consequence. For instance, Oaths became binding not by force, but by invoking the gods. Contracts were sealed with sacrifices. Feuds could be settled by shared ritual, rather than vengeance. This legal framework emphasized participation and continuity. Every citizen, rich or poor, became part of a larger cosmic choreography. You knew your place, your duties, and your days not through orders, but through ritual repetition. It was, in effect, a law without lawmakers, at least in the modern sense. The Temple of Janus and the Threshold of Peace. Perhaps no physical structure better captures Numa's legacy than the Temple of Janus. This modest shrine stood at the northeast end of the Roman Forum, marking the passage between the old Sabine lands and early Roman territory. Janus, the two-faced god of beginnings, endings, and transitions, was the patron of doors, thresholds, and change. Numa decreed that the doors of Janus's temple should be open only in times of war and shut during peace. During his reign, they remained permanently closed, a symbolic declaration of intentional stillness. This was Rome's first civic peace policy, and it made an impression. Later rulers would reopen the temple's doors with great reluctance or pride. Augustus famously declared he had closed them 3 times, signaling peace across the empire. But Numa had done it first, and without conquest. The subtle control of belief. While Numa is remembered for his humility, there's a layer of political sophistication in his methods. By grounding kingship in ritual law, he reduced the threat of rebellion, as even critics had to follow sacred rules. Reinforced civic unity, as all Romans were subject to the same sacred obligations. Prevented arbitrary rule, as kings themselves were subject to divine interpretation. It was a quiet system of checks and balances, not legalistic, but spiritual and social. Power was wrapped in ritual garb, and no one, not even the king, stood above the gods. Death and a sacred disappearance. When Numa died peacefully, after more than 4 decades of rule, he left no palace, no tomb adorned with weapons, no city conquered. What he left was a blueprint of sacred infrastructure. Legend claims he was buried with 12 books, half of them sacred, half philosophical. When rediscovered centuries later, the Senate burned them. Whether due to fear, impurity, or political disruption, we'll never know. But their destruction tells us this: Numa's memory was too sacred or too disruptive to be unpacked. He became a symbol, not just a man. Ending thought. If Numa taught Rome to rule by ritual and belief, what would happen when kings began to use that belief as a mask for personal power? Could the sacred institutions he built be twisted into tools of ambition? A city cloaked in ritual. By the end of Numa Pompilius's reign, Rome stood encased in a quiet spiritual order. The swords had been sheathed. The gods had been placated. The rituals, constant, detailed, often obscure, had transformed civic life into sacred routine. Every part of Roman society, from farming to funerals, was now tethered to divine observance. But beneath that careful structure was a growing tension. Numa had bound the city to the gods, yes, but he had also handed enormous influence to those who interpreted the gods. Priests, augurs, pontifices, these were now gatekeepers of action, able to stall or permit any political move. Sacred law, once a stabilizing force, could now be used strategically. And with his death, Rome faced a new dilemma. Could peace survive ambition? The legacy of ritual power. Numa's reforms had made religion inseparable from public authority. To act without religious sanction was un-Roman. Every treaty, law, and battle required auspices, signs from the gods. But what if those signs could be faked, reinterpreted, or delayed? Numa had intended to build restraint into Roman life. But in doing so, he also created mechanisms of control. The pontifices could manipulate the calendar to prolong or delay elections. The augurs could claim poor omens to stop votes or cancel assemblies. Sacred offices became paths to influence, and eventually, to power without accountability. Over time, the sacred structure that had kept Rome still began to harden not just with reverence, but with political rigidity. The shift back toward war. After Numa's death, the kingship passed to Tullus Hostilius, a man as warlike as Numa was peaceful. In almost every way, Tullus was Numa's opposite, impatient with ritual, eager for glory, and dismissive of the priesthood. Yet even he couldn't escape Numa's legacy. Before engaging in war with Alba Longa, Rome's ancestral rival, Tullus was required to consult the augurs. He scoffed at the process but performed it. He mocked religious rites but observed them publicly. It was now impossible for a Roman king, even a belligerent one, to rule without the spiritual structures Numa had built. And ironically, this performance of piety gave later kings the freedom to pursue very unspiritual goals, cloaked in sacred legitimacy. Ritual as justification for expansion. Under Tullus Hostilius and later kings like Tarquinius Priscus, divine signs were used to justify military ambition. Victories were painted as signs of favor from Jupiter. Omens were read not as warnings but as permissions. The role of augurs shifted, from interpreters of divine will to validators of political desire. Rome was expanding, absorbing Latin towns, building roads, consolidating its military. And at every step, a ritual shield accompanied the blade. Numa's sacred system, designed for inner peace, was now weaponized for outer conquest. The problem of interpretation. Another challenge emerged. As Rome grew, the rituals became more complex, but their meaning became more obscure. Few Romans understood the origins of the ancient rites. Even fewer questioned them. As long as the correct gestures were performed, the gods were considered satisfied. This created a new dynamic, form over substance. Rituals became performative. Sacred duties were observed not out of belief, but out of obligation or ambition. It was in this context that Tarquinius Superbus, the seventh and final king, would later rise, a man who embodied the appearance of piety while ruling with cruelty and fear. Numa's institutions in decline. By the late regal period, the offices created by Numa were increasingly held by politically motivated elites. The Pontifex Maximus, once the guardian of sacred tradition, became a tool of policy. The calendar was manipulated. Sacred space was used for personal advantage. Yet the institutions themselves were never questioned. No matter how corrupt their administrators became, the rituals endured. Romans believed that to abandon the rites was to invite destruction. And so, even the most brutal or ambitious rulers cloaked themselves in Numa's robes, muttering prayers and sacrificing cattle, even as they plotted conquest. In this way, Numa's great gift to Rome, the idea that order could replace violence, became a moral mask for a more sophisticated kind of power. The Sibylline books, Belief at a Price. A telling episode near the end of the regal period highlights the transformation of sacred authority. During the reign of Tarquinius Superbus, a mysterious woman later known as the Cumaean Sibyl offered the king 9 prophetic books for an exorbitant price. He refused. She burned 3. She returned, offering the remaining 6 for the same price. Again, he refused. She burned another 3. On her final offer, she presented the last 3 books for the original price. Tarquinius, unnerved by her persistence, agreed. These books, called the Sibylline books, were kept in the temple of Jupiter to be consulted during great crises. But they weren't freely read. They were interpreted by appointed priests, whose role was to interpret the unreadable. This was the final stage in the system Numa had begun. Divine guidance mediated through human gatekeepers, whose authority came not from war or law but from mystery. Ritual as foundation and fossil. By the close of the regal period, Rome had become dependent on sacred institutions, but those institutions had become detached from their original purpose. What had begun as a way to restrain ambition became a tool of elite negotiation. What had been designed to harmonize Rome with the gods now allowed kings to claim divine support, regardless of justice. And yet this system also gave Rome stability. Even as kings changed and power shifted, the rituals persisted. The same festivals, the same processions, the same sacred fires. The sacred shell held. For now, the final priest-king. In many ways, Numa Pompilius was Rome's last priest-king in the true sense. Later kings would claim to respect the gods, but none would make ritual discipline the center of their rule. Instead, sacred law became supporting structure respected, required, but no longer central. Numa had hoped that devotion would tame ambition, but he could not prevent ambition from learning to speak the language of devotion. Echoes in the Republic and Empire. Even after the monarchy fell, Numa's influence endured. The Pontifex Maximus became the highest religious office in the Republic. The Vestal Virgins retained their privileges for centuries. The calendar, augury, and rites of war continued into the empire. Augustus, the first emperor, would famously restore many of Numa's rites, rebuilding temples, reviving forgotten festivals, and declaring himself a restorer of tradition. But even then, it was less about belief and more about legitimacy. Numa had created a Rome that needed the appearance of sacred order, even when the heart of belief had faded. Final reflection. If sacred institutions can outlast even their most devout founders, are they protecting a society or simply preserving the illusion of order? And in the hands of those who value appearance over intent, can even the purest ritual become a cage? Story 4, Cloaca Maxima, the sewer that saved a civilization. A city between hills and swamps. Imagine Rome again, not in its glory but in its grime. The hills rise dry and defensible, but the valleys between them are choked with stagnant water. The Forum, that future symbol of Roman life, is a soggy basin. Frogs croak where senators will one day argue. Mosquitoes swarm where markets will bustle. In the dry months, the smell hangs over the city like a wet cloak. In the wet months, the streets become rivers. This is pre-engineered Rome, a city surrounded not by enemies, but by its own geography. And yet, in a feat of engineering and willpower that remains astonishing even now, early Romans, likely under the guidance of their kings, would build something few ancient cities dared to attempt: a sewer system. Not a simple ditch, not a seasonal trench, but a monumental, vaulted underground channel, capable of carrying the city's waste, runoff, and stormwater to the Tiber River. They would call it the Cloaca Maxima, the Great Drain. And while it may seem mundane, this forgotten marvel helped Rome survive and grow. A problem too dirty to ignore. Before stone temples and law codes, Rome's most urgent challenge was drainage. The valleys between its hills, especially the one between the Palatine and Capitoline, were natural basins for rainwater. Seasonal flooding of the Tiber River compounded the issue, filling low areas with water that had nowhere to go. These wetlands were not only unpleasant, they were lethal. Stagnant water breeds mosquitoes. Mosquitoes bring disease. Waste from animals, people, and market refuse added to the rot. The Forum Valley, eventually, the symbolic heart of Rome, was virtually uninhabitable. For a city that intended to grow, this was a death sentence in slow motion. The first cuts in the earth. The earliest solutions were simple: shallow ditches, temporary canals. These were cut into the slopes of the Palatine and Capitoline to direct water downhill. Likely during the reign of Tarquin the Elder, Tarquinius Priscus, these ditches were expanded, linked, and covered in places with timber planks. But wooden channels decayed, collapsed, or clogged easily. Rome needed something more permanent and ambitious. That's when someone, perhaps a king, perhaps an Etruscan engineer, proposed a radical idea: cut a channel beneath the city, engineering a sewer before the Republic. The Cloaca Maxima, in its earliest form, began as a massive open-air trench, likely dug by enslaved laborers or conscripted citizens. It cut through the Forum Valley, creating a pathway for water to flow west toward the Tiber. Soon, parts of the channel were vaulted over with stone, creating the first underground segments. To modern eyes, this may seem unremarkable, but in the 6th century BCE, it was unprecedented. The use of arch-shaped vaulting and large stone blocks to contain and direct water under a city was virtually unknown outside of Mesopotamia. This was not a copy. It was a Roman adaptation of Etruscan engineering practices, married with Roman stubbornness. The city may have lacked grandeur, but it had vision. Etruscan influence, the hidden blueprint. Many historians credit the technical foundation of the Cloaca Maxima to Etruscan expertise. The Etruscans, Rome's northern neighbors and cultural ancestors, were master builders. They understood hydraulics, stone vaulting, and gravity-fed drainage. Tarquinius Priscus, himself of Etruscan heritage, likely recruited Etruscan architects to manage the project. The idea was straightforward, but the execution was formidable. Carve a channel through mud, clay, and tufa. Line it with stone, shaped and placed by hand. Use gravity to maintain constant flow. Ventilate and maintain access through surface openings. Over time, as more parts were roofed over, the cloaca became a true sewer and a piece of civic infrastructure that defined Roman identity more than most statues or triumphs. Sanitation and stability. The immediate effects were profound. With the Forum Valley drained, public life could flourish. Markets could be held. Buildings could be raised. Waterborne diseases, though never eliminated, were mitigated. The psychological change was also important. The city had conquered not an enemy but its own land. This gave early Romans a confidence that bordered on spiritual. If they could drain a swamp, what couldn't they do? In fact, the project was so closely tied to sacred duty that it became ritualized. The cloaca was not just functional, it was holy. A sewer worth worshipping. Strange as it may seem, the Cloaca Maxima was considered divinely touched. In time, it was associated with Venus Closina, a hybrid goddess of love and purification. A small shrine, the Sacellum Closini, was built above the sewer's outlet near the Forum. Coins were tossed in. Prayers were offered. Romans believed that managing waste wasn't just a public service, it was a spiritual obligation. Purity and pollution were deeply intertwined in Roman religious thought. The act of flushing waste away from sacred spaces was as much a rite as it was an engineering feat. Maintenance, the most boring heroism. While kings and generals received statues, those who maintained the Cloaca Maxima were largely anonymous. Yet their work was essential. Sewer maintenance required crawling through tunnels, removing debris, reinforcing stone, and ensuring that storm surges didn't back up into the Forum. Teams of slaves, laborers, and later publicani, private contractors, were tasked with keeping the cloaca open, especially after floods. Later emperors, including Agrippa and Domitian, would organize large-scale cleaning and even renovations. They didn't do it for glory, they did it because the city couldn't survive without it. The Forum emerges. With the Forum Valley drained, Rome's urban center could finally take shape. Temples, markets, speaking platforms, and courts were erected on ground that had once been marshland. But this wasn't just a matter of infrastructure, it was identity. The Cloaca Maxima, flowing invisibly beneath the city, made Roman civilization possible. It wasn't a wall or a monument. It wasn't built to be admired, but it worked. And Romans, more than any other ancient people, came to respect what worked even if it smelled. A precedent for practical power. The success of the Cloaca Maxima would set a precedent for Roman engineering. Utilitarian design over aesthetics. Large-scale public works as political capital. Water control as civic pride. These values would echo later in aqueducts, baths, roads, and ports. Rome became not just a military power, but a civil engineering empire. But it all started with sewage. Ending thought. If Rome's first great infrastructure project was underground and unseen, what does that say about the foundations of empires? Can greatness begin in places no one wants to look? What lies beneath a city? The Cloaca Maxima was never just a sewer. Even in the early centuries of the Roman kingdom, the act of controlling water where it gathered, how it moved, where it went became a form of civic power. Unlike walls or temples, it did not declare itself with grandeur or noise. It worked in silence, and yet everything in Rome began to depend on it. Underneath the political systems, the ritual calendars, and the growing ambitions of Rome's kings, the cloaca flowed quietly, determining the city's limits, its health, and even its identity. From marshland to monument, the Forum, the very center of Roman public life, only came into being because of the Cloaca Maxima. Draining the valley between the Palatine and Capitoline hills gave Rome a place for markets, forumbrium, legal trials and public meetings, temples and altars, speeches and announcements. Before the sewer, none of this was possible. The valley was a wetland, subject to the Tiber's seasonal flooding and teeming with disease. By creating a dry, usable space, the sewer did not just support public life, it enabled it. And over time, the Forum became more than a meeting ground. It became a symbol of Roman identity, and everything built atop it owed its stability to what flowed beneath it. Civic ritual meets sanitation. Though the Cloaca Maxima started as a practical solution, it quickly became ritualized, woven into the sacred and symbolic functions of the state. As mentioned earlier, the goddess Venus Clocina was given a shrine directly above the sewer's outlet. But this was not just a minor cult. The association of purity with cleanliness and moral decay with literal waste meant that the sewer came to represent the moral plumbing of Rome. Public sanitation was not just health policy, it was a moral imperative. Even the Vestal Virgins, Rome's sacred priestesses, were connected to purification. Sacred rites required clean spaces, clean water, and clean hands. And it was the Cloaca Maxima that protected the sacred from the profane, diverting filth from the heart of the city. Who owned the water? One of the consequences of building a drainage system was the question of authority. In early Rome, much of the land and water use was communal, but as the city expanded, control over water became political. The sewer system established a precedent. Only the state had the right to manage public water. This extended beyond waste. It applied to future aqueducts, which would distribute clean water. It governed baths, fountains, and irrigation channels. It created legal categories around public versus private water rights. The early kings, particularly Servius Tullius and later Tarquinius Superbus, recognized that those who controlled water infrastructure also controlled the people. A functioning sewer wasn't just a public good, it was a symbol of centralized power. Drainage and urban planning. The existence of a permanent drainage system allowed for something entirely new in Rome: urban planning. With the Forum Valley drained, buildings could be organized by function. Roads could follow structured paths. Temples and homes could be placed with long-term purpose, not just wherever high ground was available. For example, the Via Sacra, the sacred way, was laid down along land now dry enough to support heavy foot traffic. The Basilica Aemilia and other early public buildings were placed along the former floodplain, now dry thanks to the cloaca. Low-lying areas, once used as animal pens, were repurposed into public gathering places. This planning created a predictable cityscape important not just for movement, but for governance and taxation. Maintenance as civic order. As the Cloaca Maxima grew more complex, so did the need for maintenance. Clearing debris, repairing stonework, and ensuring that runoff flowed properly required ongoing labor. This led to the formation of urban maintenance teams first composed of slaves, then later public contractors publicani, paid from city funds. The system created a quiet bureaucracy of managers, inspectors, and workers whose job was to preserve the unseen. Their work wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even widely acknowledged, but it represented something critical, the idea that Rome's continuity depended on the invisible on work done in dark tunnels, in foul water, with no fanfare. This would become a hallmark of Roman administration, anonymous labor in the service of public order. The politics of sewers. By the later regal period, kings began to use the cloaca for more than just sanitation. The system became political leverage. During the reign of Tarquinius Superbus, the last king of Rome, the sewer system was expanded. But this wasn't out of public-mindedness. The king wanted to clear more land for temples, palaces, and military storage. To accomplish this, he conscripted large amounts of forced labor, including prisoners and debtors. The work was brutal and often deadly. Stones were dragged and set by hand. The tunnels were carved without ventilation. Collapse was common. The expansion of the Cloaca Maxima under Tarquinius was impressive, but it was also an act of tyranny, using infrastructure to impose control and extract labor. This duality of public works, as both progress and oppression, would repeat throughout Roman history. Drainage as a social divider. The cloaca also exposed early social divides. The wealthier Romans, often residing on higher ground, had less direct need for the sewer. They enjoyed dry air, fresh water, and distance from waste. The poorer classes, living in lower-lying regions and working near the forum or riverfront, depended on the sewer but were also most at risk from its failures. Floods, backups, and collapses disproportionately affected these neighborhoods. Yet, they had little say in how the system was managed. The cloaca, then, became not just a physical boundary, but a symbolic one, marking the gap between those who ruled and those who labored beneath the surface. An unlikely survival. Despite neglect, flood, war, and change, the Cloaca Maxima continued to function. By the time of the Republic, it had been expanded, connected to smaller sewers, and reinforced in parts with concrete and brick. It was tied into the city's growth, running beneath new buildings, linking to public baths, latrines, and fountains. The Forum Romanum, the beating heart of the Republic, still relied on it. When Caesar built the Basilica Julia, he had its foundations adapted to avoid compromising the ancient sewer below. Even emperors like Augustus, centuries later, still considered its maintenance a matter of state. And today, yes, today parts of the Cloaca Maxima still run beneath modern Rome, carrying stormwater into the Tiber. More than a sewer. Rome is remembered for its legions, its emperors, its laws. But perhaps its first true conquest was that of its own geography. To drain a swamp, to dig a channel, to let water move where it should, that was the beginning. Because in that act, Rome learned how to master nature, organize labor, plan a city, and create continuity. All in the name of something no one wanted to talk about: waste. Ending thought. If one of Rome's most essential achievements was hidden beneath its feet, how many other forces in history shaped the world from below, quietly, without statues or songs? An underground inheritance. By the time the last kings of Rome were overthrown and the Republic rose in their place, the Cloaca Maxima had already become one of the most enduring features of the city. It had outlasted monarchs, weathered floods, and seen the transformation of Rome from a marshy settlement into a structured, civic-minded city-state. But its purpose was no longer limited to drainage. It had become a symbol, a tool, a metaphor, and above all, a testament to endurance. In its darkness, you could trace the outlines of the Roman mind: pragmatic, ritualistic, ambitious, and quietly obsessive about permanence. The Republic, a sewer becomes a system. As Rome expanded under the Republic, the Cloaca Maxima expanded with it, not just in size, but in function. What began as a marsh-draining ditch now formed the core of a city-wide network of drains, channels, and culverts. Engineers, now state-appointed rather than king-appointed, began creating feeder drains, linking private homes, workshops, public baths, and even latrines to the central system. These connections weren't automatic. Citizens had to petition for access. Permission was granted or denied by magistrates. This turned sewer access into a political instrument. Wealthy property owners could afford the materials and labor to connect to the system. Artisans and lower-class residents, often packed into insulae apartment buildings, lived on the margins literally and figuratively of sanitation. Despite its growing size, the Cloaca Maxima was never democratized. Like much of Rome's infrastructure, it reflected the social order: efficient, functional, but unequal. Drainage and the urban ideal. The Roman ideal of the city-urbs was one of order, geometry, and control. Streets were laid out in grids, forums were squared, aqueducts ran along engineered gradients, walls were aligned to cardinal directions. And through all of it flowed water, clean in the aqueducts, dirty in the drains. The Cloaca Maxima made this urban ideal possible. It ensured streets remained walkable after rains. Public forums could host gatherings year-round. Temples and basilicas could be built in formerly flood-prone areas. Storm surges didn't destroy the low-lying residential quarters. The sewer was what made Rome beautiful, but it was what allowed beauty to remain intact. Maintenance as civic virtue. In the Republic, sewer maintenance was assigned to curators cloacarum officials whose job was to inspect and repair the city's drainage system. These were not glamorous appointments, but they were essential. Rome even held annual inspections of the system. Slaves or workers would descend into the sewer through access shafts, sometimes chest-deep in muck, removing blockages and reinforcing cracked walls. Bronze tools, oil lamps, and even small boats were used in wider channels. It was dangerous, filthy work, but it was respected. To neglect sewer maintenance was not just administrative failure, it was sacrilege. The system was sacred, still tied to Venus Closina, still entwined with the health of the state. When emperors took notice, the emperors of Rome, ever aware of image and infrastructure, did not ignore the Cloaca Maxima. Augustus, in his sweeping restoration of the city, funded major cleaning and reinforcing projects. Agrippa, his right-hand man and a master engineer, personally oversaw sewer renovations while also building aqueducts and baths. Domitian, a later emperor, ordered new inspection points and grates placed along roads to prevent debris from entering. These emperors understood a political truth: a clean, functioning Rome was a content Rome. Even Nero, notorious for self-obsession, funded minor works on the sewer if only to ensure the Domus Aurea, his golden palace, didn't flood. From sacred to subconscious. By the late Empire, the Cloaca Maxima had become so embedded in the city that Romans rarely thought about it. This was its success and its risk. The sewer worked so well, so quietly, that people forgot it was there. When maintenance was delayed or politics disrupted repairs, flooding and foul smells returned. Only then did citizens remember that their civilized lives rested on an ancient trench dug centuries earlier by kings. In this, the sewer mirrored Rome itself, majestic on the surface, vulnerable underneath. The sewer as metaphor. Over time, Roman writers began to speak of the Cloaca Maxima metaphorically. Juvenal and Martial joked about it as a symbol of the city's moral decay. Legal scholars used it as a metaphor for removing corruption from the state. Philosophers referenced it when discussing the unseen labor required to sustain civilization. Even as the sewer remained physical, it became philosophical. Foreign eyes on Roman infrastructure. Foreign visitors and enemies alike were often astonished by Rome's water systems. Greek historians marveled at the scale. Celtic warriors who sacked the city in 390 BCE reportedly failed to damage the sewer, so solid was its construction. Centuries later, as Roman engineers built roads and aqueducts across the empire, they replicated the principles of the Cloaca Maxima. In Londinium, Caesarea, Pompeii, and Carthage, engineers built sewers that mimicked the slow, efficient descent of Rome's great drain. Water flow was controlled, streets were kept dry, latrines were flushed. The idea that public health required public infrastructure was a Roman innovation, and it flowed from the cloaca. Collapse, survival, and rediscovery. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE, many of Rome's institutions collapsed, but the cloaca did not. Medieval Rome shrank, buildings fell into ruin, and aqueducts were abandoned. Yet the Cloaca Maxima continued to carry water. Even when neglected, it functioned sometimes because of, sometimes in spite of, the people above. In the 19th century, engineers and archaeologists rediscovered its arched passages. To their astonishment, many sections remained intact. They found blocks of tufa, still fitted without mortar, brick reinforcements from the imperial period, flowing water, still directed to the Tiber. Today, some parts of the Cloaca Maxima are still in use. Tourists in Rome walk unknowingly over a sewer older than the Republic, older than Caesar, older than the Colosseum. A legacy buried, not forgotten. The Cloaca Maxima never had an official completion date. It was always evolving, always being cleaned, patched, widened. But perhaps that's the best metaphor for civilization itself. You never finish building a city. You maintain it quietly, constantly. And while emperors and generals are remembered in books and statues, it is the hidden systems, the drains, the ditches, the stones beneath sandals that carry a people forward. The Cloaca Maxima reminds us that sometimes the greatest triumphs are those that go unseen, uncelebrated, but never unneeded. Final reflection. If Rome's greatness flowed through invisible channels, how many other foundations of civilization, quiet, unglamorous, essential, have shaped history without ever making it into the spotlight? Story 5, Tarquinius Priscus, the immigrant king who built the circus. A king from elsewhere. Rome, as early Romans liked to say, was a city of outcasts. It had welcomed exiles, fugitives, and foreigners from the very start. Yet even in such a place, the rise of Lucius Tarquinius Priscus stood out. He was not born Roman. He wasn't even Latin. He was an Etruscan, a man from a different people, speaking a different language, wearing different clothes, and bearing a name that sounded foreign to Roman ears. And yet he would become Rome's 5th king. He would build the foundations of its public games, expand its infrastructure, and shape its future. His reign was not one of peaceful ritual or mythic war, it was one of ambition through construction. Tarquinius Priscus built not with the sword, but with stone, spectacle, and spectacle's greatest stage, the Circus Maximus. From Demaratus to Lucumo, the roots of Tarquin. Tarquinius was born Lucumo, the son of a wealthy Greek immigrant named Demaratus of Corinth, who had fled to the Etruscan city of Tarquinii during a time of political unrest. Demaratus brought with him Greek ideas, skills, and artisans' men who would quietly influence the architecture and culture of central Italy. Lucumo married Tanaquil, a woman of high Etruscan birth, sharp intellect, and political foresight. She believed her husband was destined for greatness, but she also knew that Etruscan society would never fully accept a half-Greek outsider as its leader. So they left for Rome, a city known, even then, for its openness to newcomers with ambition. Tanaquil and the prophecy. According to tradition, as they approached Rome, a strange omen occurred. An eagle swooped down, snatched Lucumo's cap from his head, circled in the sky, and returned it gently. Tanaquil, trained in augury, declared it a sign from the gods that Lucumo was destined to wear a crown. Once in Rome, Lucumo changed his name to Lucius Tarquinius, adopting a Romanized identity to gain favor. Through generosity, intelligence, and political savvy, he gained the trust of King Ancus Marcius, the fourth king of Rome, who appointed him guardian of his sons. Upon Ancus's death, Tarquinius maneuvered his way into power not through war, but by outpoliticking the royal family. The immigrant was now king, a builder before all else. Tarquinius understood something essential. In a city where ancestry was thin and institutions young, monuments could be memory. And so, he began to build not just to glorify himself, but to anchor his legacy in stone. He focused on projects that would transform the physical face of Rome. He expanded the Forum with porticos and public structures. He reinforced the Cloaca Maxima, continuing the work of his predecessors. He laid out plans for a grand temple on the Capitoline Hill, a project that would one day become the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, Rome's spiritual high point. But perhaps his boldest and most culturally transformative project was something else entirely: the creation of public games on a scale Rome had never seen. The first Ludi Romani, games for a new people. Tarquinius introduced the Ludi Romani, or Roman Games, an annual spectacle of horse racing, athletic contests, and theatrical displays, all conducted as part of a religious festival. To host them, he began constructing a dedicated venue, a long, oval-shaped track nestled in the valley between the Aventine and Palatine Hills. This would become the earliest version of what we now call the Circus Maximus. The games served several purposes. Political, they entertained the masses and increased the king's popularity. Religious, they were held in honor of Jupiter and other deities, reinforcing the king's piety. Social, they created shared experiences across social classes. They were also spectacles of control, organized, impressive, and public. In a city still young and fractious, a shared celebration offered unity. The beginnings of the Circus Maximus. The original circus was rudimentary. It lacked permanent seating, walls, or monuments, but it had form and purpose. A track marked out in the valley. Wooden benches for nobles and important citizens. An open field for the crowd to stand, cheer, and bet. Temporary awnings and stands for food vendors. Even in this early form, the circus became the largest public gathering space in Rome. It would grow over time, expanded, decorated, and rebuilt by emperors, but Tarquinius laid its foundations, a place where Rome could watch itself perform its own greatness. Immigrant influence, Roman identity. Tarquinius, though foreign-born, Romanized every part of his reign. He adopted Roman customs. He promoted religious rites. He cast his building projects as gifts to the people. But his Etruscan roots never vanished. They came through in his use of arches and stone masonry. His focus on urban design, organizing space with purpose. His incorporation of religious spectacle with political messaging. In many ways, he modeled what Rome would become, a city that absorbed the foreign and made it Roman. The politics of entertainment. By creating the games, Tarquinius did more than entertain, he distracted. Public games diverted attention from political tensions. They built loyalty among citizens who might otherwise oppose a king of foreign origin. They reinforced hierarchies. Seating was arranged by status, while promoting shared culture. This strategy would be replicated for centuries. Emperors like Caesar, Augustus, and Trajan would build ever larger circuses and amphitheaters, offering panem et circenses, bread and circuses, to the people. But Tarquinius had done it first. Unfinished projects, unfinished reign. Tarquinius's building campaigns were ambitious, but many were left incomplete at his death. According to tradition, he was assassinated by the sons of Ancus Marcius, the previous king, who resented being passed over for the throne. His wife, Tanaquil, hid his death long enough to install their protege, Servius Tullius, as successor. The immigrant king's rule was over, but his works, especially the circus, continued to define the city. Ending thought. If a foreign-born king could shape Rome's identity with stone and spectacle, what happens when the kingship itself becomes an inheritance, not a vision, but of vengeance? A king's vision set in brick. Tarquinius Priscus ruled not by sword or conquest, but by reshaping the physical landscape of Rome. In an age when cities were still defined more by settlement patterns than by structure, he sought to bind identity to architecture. His buildings were his proclamations, his stones his decrees. Under his reign, Rome began to resemble something more permanent, more inevitable, more Roman. But this wasn't just a king building things. This was an immigrant using infrastructure to claim legitimacy, to make a new home undeniable, and to ensure his name would endure in the very walls of the city. The Forum as theater of power. Though the Forum had existed since earlier kings drained the valley, it was still an open, undefined space. Tarquinius brought intentionality to it. He built colonnades and porticos, early versions of the civic architecture that would later define Roman urban life. These shaded walkways and gathering spots weren't just shelters, they were settings for public exchange. He had sections of the Forum paved with stone, a labor-intensive process requiring carefully cut slabs, transported from afar. These roads were not built for convenience, they were a statement. Rome was no longer a place of paths, but a city of streets. By crafting a forum with structure, Tarquinius offered Rome a public identity, something all citizens, no matter their class, could recognize as central and shared. Laying foundations for Jupiter. Of all his projects, none would prove more symbolically powerful or more incomplete than the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill. This was to be Rome's highest temple, dedicated to the chief deity of the Roman pantheon, and designed to rival the greatest temples of Etruria or Greece. Its foundations were enormous, requiring stone imported from Veii and Gabii, deep trenches filled with gravel and compacted clay, massive stone drums and walls, laid with precision on the slope of the Capitoline. The project itself was religious and political. Elevating Jupiter was a way to centralize divine favor on the city and on the king himself. It also aimed to elevate Rome's prestige, suggesting that Rome was not merely a Latin outpost, but a spiritual center. Though the temple would not be completed in Tarquinius's lifetime, his successor, Servius Tullius, and later Tarquinius Superbus would continue it. Its beginnings marked the ambition of Rome to dominate not just land, but also divine space. Spectacle and surveillance, refining the circus. Tarquinius's games were already becoming institutionalized as annual events, but the space in which they were held, the early Circus Maximus, was also evolving. He installed permanent wooden seating for the senatorial class, placing them in clearly marked positions of honor. This was more than comfort, it was a visual expression of hierarchy. The circus, like the Forum, became a mirror of society. He had starting gates, carceres, constructed, so races could begin in synchronized fashion, a mark of organization. He also began designing a central spina, a median strip dividing the track, to better control the flow of chariot races. Even early obelisks and statues, symbols of religious and civic pride, began to appear along the circus axis. It was not merely a track anymore. It was becoming Rome's first arena. City walls and military logic. Tarquinius also expanded the city's defensive walls. Though Rome's early walls were modest, mostly earthworks and wooden palisades, under Tarquinius they began to include stone reinforcements, especially on vulnerable sides like the Esquiline and Quirinal hills. His efforts weren't purely militaristic. Building walls was also about defining the city's limits, establishing who was inside the civic space and who remained beyond. This separation was symbolically loaded. To be within Rome's walls was to be within its legal, religious, and social identity. And because Rome lacked natural topographic boundaries in some directions, these walls were a statement of control over nature, much like the Cloaca Maxima. The king's network, roads, bridges, and the first grid. Though the famous Roman roads would come later, Tarquinius began laying out pathways that would evolve into major streets, using rectilinear planning in places where haphazard trails once sufficed. Some historians believe he initiated rudimentary surveys that would later inspire the centuriation system, dividing land into neat grids for assignment and taxation. He also invested in bridge work, most notably the Pons Sublicius, a wooden bridge across the Tiber. Though often credited to Ancus Marcius, the bridge was expanded and maintained under Tarquinius's reign, reflecting his focus on connectivity and expansion. This infrastructure did more than move people, it moved ideas, commerce, and power. Stone and symbol, architecture as authority. What made Tarquinius's building projects unique wasn't their scale, though they were grand, but their intentional symbolism. Every wall defined a boundary of inclusion. Every temple elevated the state's divine mandate. Every public space reminded citizens of the king's provision. He didn't build monuments to himself. He built systems that outlasted him, and in doing so, ensured his influence would flow beneath later regimes, like the foundations beneath a temple. Enemies within. But not everyone saw these projects as signs of Rome's greatness. For the sons of Ancus Marcius, the former king, each new stone laid was a reminder of what they had lost. They watched as a foreigner, with no claim of descent from Romulus, no birth in Latium, rose to command not just the people but the very face of the city. Tarquinius, for all his charm and diplomacy, had made enemies within. And as the forum filled with traitors and the circus echoed with cheers, plots began to form in the shadows. They would strike not through rebellion, but through assassination. The architecture of legacy. Even as whispers of conspiracy grew, Tarquinius pressed forward with his building. In this, he revealed a defining Roman trait, the belief that structure is stability, that by reshaping a city one could reshape fate. But fate, as Roman mythology often reminded its people, had its own plans. The king who built the temple would not live to see it finished. The king who mapped the city would not die within it. His legacy would be passed on not to his sons, but to a protege, a man of lower birth named Servius Tullius, whose own rise would follow in similar, symbolic footsteps. Ending thought. If a city can be remade through structure, what happens when its walls and streets are inherited by those with no memory of the hands that built them? A reign interrupted. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus had done what no one else had. A foreigner and outsider had seized the Roman throne not by the force of arms but by force of presence. He had offered the people not just leadership, but an infrastructure for their lives. The circus to thrill, the forum to gather, the sewer to drain, the temple to inspire. But Rome was still a place of familial vengeance and ambition, not laws or smooth transitions of power. Tarquinius's reign would be cut short not by war, nor revolt, but by revenge. The sons of Ancus strike. It had been decades since Ancus Marcius, Rome's fourth king, had died. Yet his sons, denied succession by the cunning Tarquinius, had nursed their resentment like an heirloom passed down from father to son. They saw Tarquinius's every project as evidence of stolen power. They did not see stone, they saw betrayal. They did not see grandeur, they saw a foreigner making himself Roman in ways they could never forgive. As Tarquinius aged, and his grip on Rome's politics weakened, they struck. Disguised as messengers requesting an audience with the king, they approached him with deference, then assassinated him in his own palace. The king who had given Rome the circus died behind closed doors, not in battle, not in ceremony. Just like that, his voice was silenced. The queen who delayed death. The city, leaderless, should have fallen into chaos. But Tanaquil, Tarquinius's wife, acted with chilling resolve. While the king's body was quietly removed and the news suppressed, she declared that Tarquinius had only been wounded and would soon recover. In the meantime, she said, his duties would be carried out by a trusted administrator, Servius Tullius. This deception gave Servius time to consolidate power, rally allies, and build public support. By the time the king's death was admitted, Servius was already acting as king in all but name. Rome had been guided by the will of a foreign queen, and once again, the immigrant's legacy endured through adaptation. Servius Tullius, the king's successor, not his son. Servius Tullius, the man chosen by Tanaquil, was of uncertain birth. Some accounts claimed he was the son of a slave. Others said he was of noble Latin lineage. But what mattered most was that he had been raised in the royal household and had shown early signs of brilliance. According to legend, when he was a child, a flame danced above his head, without burning him, an omen read by Tanaquil as a sign of greatness. Tarquinius had mentored him, Tanaquil had trusted him, now Rome would be his. Continuity through infrastructure. Though Tarquinius's life ended abruptly, his vision did not. Servius Tullius continued many of his mentor's projects. He completed the Temple of Jupiter, making good on the grand vision started on the Capitoline. He formalized the census, allowing for more structured tax collection and military service. He improved the city's defenses, adding new fortifications to the Servian wall, which would stand for centuries. The games Tarquinius had founded became annual traditions, woven into the civic calendar. The Circus Maximus was gradually expanded. What began as temporary wooden benches soon evolved into stone tiers and decorated facades. Tarquinius had built a stage. Servius ensured the performance continued. Memory in the stones. Rome did not build statues to Tarquinius Priscus. No triumphal arches bore his name. No surviving writings celebrated his achievements. He left behind no bloodline of kings. But his imprint on the physical city could not be erased. The Forum, structured and open. The Circus, a space of public unity and distraction. The Cloaca Maxima, still flowing beneath Rome's feet. The Capitoline Hill, anchored by sacred stone. These were not just constructions. They were memories built in brick and carved in time. His was a legacy of utility, not spectacle, and in that it was truly Roman. A king without a tomb. Strangely, we know almost nothing about Tarquinius's final resting place. Unlike Romulus, who vanished into myth, or Numa, who was given ritualistic honors, Tarquinius's death passed quietly. There was no funeral procession, no pyre, no temple built in his name. His legacy lived through roads, drains, seats, and shadows. Perhaps that is fitting. For a man who built a city for others, what need had he for a monument to himself? From immigrant to architect of Rome. Tarquinius Priscus is often overshadowed by the more dramatic stories of kings who came before or after him, but none shaped the physical structure of Rome like he did. He taught Rome that public space was political power. He showed that games and structures could forge identity, that temples could legitimize a reign, and that foreign hands could build something deeply Roman. He was the immigrant who made himself indispensable not by force, but by foundation. The echoes in the circus. For centuries after his death, Romans gathered in the Circus Maximus to watch chariots race, athletes perform, and rulers parade. Few would remember the king who first cleared the land and marked the oval. But every time the people roared from the stands, every time the crowd leaned into a turn or bet on a color, they were living in the shadow of Tarquinius's vision. His name faded, but his idea of Rome endured. Final reflection. If a forgotten king can shape the rituals of 1,000 years, what parts of our own lives are built on foundations we'll never see or remember? Story 6. The Sabine Women Peace Through Abduction. A city of men, a problem of legacy. In its earliest days, Rome was little more than a gathering of rough shelters clustered near the Palatine Hill. Under the rule of Romulus, the city had walls, order, and ambition, but it lacked women. This, for the ancient mind, was not simply a matter of companionship or reproduction. A city without women could not endure. It could not produce heirs. It could not establish dynasties, transfer property, or sustain religious rites tied to family lineage. Romulus had built Rome for men on the margins, exiles, escaped slaves, outlaws. These men came to Rome seeking asylum, but none brought families. And so, to solve this most foundational of problems, Romulus turned to one of the oldest strategies known to kings and conquerors: marriage by conquest. An invitation with ulterior motives. The neighboring Sabines, a people of central Italy, had long lived in the hills north of the Tiber. They were numerous, prosperous, and most crucially family-oriented. Romulus sent friendly envoys to the Sabines and other Latin tribes, inviting them to a grand festival in honor of Neptune Equester, the god of horses and the sea. The promise was games, feasts, and rituals. The invitation was accepted. Hundreds of Sabine families, men, women, and children, entered the young city's gates with trust. They came to celebrate. They would leave in mourning. The seizure during the games. According to Livy and Plutarch, as the festival reached its peak, races underway, wine flowing, crowds distracted, Romulus gave a prearranged signal. His men, stationed among the guests, leapt up and seized the Sabine women. The action was sudden and coordinated. The men grabbed women from the crowds, carried them off into Roman households, and defended their actions with shields and arms. The Sabine men, shocked and overwhelmed, were pushed out of the city. The women, stunned and screaming, were suddenly wives. The Romans did not see this as rape in the modern sense. The Latin phrase raptio, from which we derive rape, meant seizure or abduction, not sexual violation. But to the victims and to history, the violence of the act remains deeply unsettling. Romulus's justification. After the attack, Romulus himself addressed the abducted women. In a speech that blends manipulation, persuasion, and proto-patriarchal logic, he attempted to reframe the abduction as a gift. You shall live in honorable wedlock, enjoy half of all we have, and become mothers of a great people. He promised them protection, status, and offspring. He reminded them that their new husbands were not strangers. They were men who had risked everything to build a new life and now desired partnership. It was a speech meant to transform victims into matriarchs, and disturbingly, many of the women began to accept their new roles. The women settle into Rome. The initial days were filled with grief, anger, and resistance, but over time, the women cut off from their birth families, immersed in Roman households, began to adapt. They were treated with a mix of reverence and guilt. Their new husbands tried to win their favor, not simply impose their rule. In many ways, these women became Rome's first peaceweavers, carrying Sabine customs into Roman homes, raising mixed-heritage children, and softening the raw aggression of the early city. What was meant as a political act became a strange, traumatic form of social integration. The Sabine response. Back in the Sabine lands, outrage was immediate. Several neighboring tribes, angry at the betrayal, waged short, unsuccessful wars against Rome. Each was repelled. But the Sabines, under the command of King Titus Tatius, prepared for a more strategic assault. They gathered troops, trained in secrecy, and marched on Rome with the intent not merely to retaliate but to reclaim. They aimed to take back their daughters, their sisters, their wives. Rome braced for civil war born of domestic treachery. The siege of the Capitoline. Titus Tatius, aided by a Roman defector named Tarpeia, gained access to the Capitoline Hill, Rome's most defensible position. The betrayal was almost mythic. Tarpeia, a Roman maiden, agreed to open the gates in exchange for what the Sabines wore on their arms. She meant gold bracelets. Instead, they crushed her with their shields, the other thing they wore on their arms. Her name would be remembered forever in the Tarpeian Rock, from which traitors were later thrown. With the hill taken, the Sabines launched a full-scale battle inside the city. Roman and Sabine warriors clashed in the very space where the Forum would later rise. Blood flowed where festivals had been held. Fathers fought sons-in-law. Brothers fought brothers. The war had come home. The women intervened. And then something remarkable happened. As the battle reached its height, the Sabine women, those who had been abducted, now Roman wives, rushed into the battlefield. They carried infants in their arms. They stepped between spears and shields. They begged both sides to stop. Livy records their plea. "We are mothers now, mothers of your grandchildren, your nephews. If you kill our husbands, you make us widows. If you kill our fathers, you orphan our sons. Whom are we to mourn?" Their words pierced through rage. In that moment, neither Roman nor Sabine could act without destroying family. The fighting stopped. Ending thought. If a city is built on violence, but peace is won through the pleas of the conquered, can the legacy of that city ever be truly innocent? A pause in the clash. The moment was charged with silence. In the center of what had been a blood-soaked battlefield, Sabine women, now Roman wives and mothers, stood between two armies. On one side, Romulus, the founder of Rome, bloodied but defiant. On the other, Titus Tatius, king of the Sabines, grim with purpose. Both men held power, pride, and loyalty in their hands. But before them stood women who had survived violation, redefinition, and assimilation, now pleading for peace. These women, abducted as symbols of conquest, had become embodiments of reconciliation. They were no longer property, they were bridges. And so the swords were lowered. A kingdom divided, a rule shared. Out of the blood and dust rose an unprecedented compromise. Romulus and Titus Tatius agreed to rule together jointly and equally. It was not a merger born of treaty, but of necessity. Rome and the Sabines would unite into a single community, with two kings, two armies, and two sets of traditions. This arrangement is often overlooked in Rome's regal history, where kings are seen as solitary rulers. But for several years, Rome was a dual monarchy, a city led not by dominance, but by mutual rule. The Palatine Hill remained Romulus's seat of power. The Capitoline Hill, once seized through betrayal, now served as Tatius's domain. The city's boundaries expanded. The citizen body doubled. For the first time, Rome was not simply Latin, it was multi-ethnic, incorporating the Sabine name, customs, and gods, creating a new civic identity. The unification presented immediate challenges. How do you fuse two distinct cultures? How do you create shared rituals, laws, and social customs without erasing either side? In response, the Romans, under this temporary unity, took one of the most significant steps in their early statecraft. They blended tradition into a new civic identity. Sabine priests were integrated into the Roman religious orders. Joint festivals were created, some of which would evolve into the sacred Lupercalia and Consualia. The Roman Senate expanded to include Sabine elders, creating a more representative, if still elite, advisory body. A city once marked by division began to wear integration as its foundation. This union wasn't about coexistence, it was about absorption. The Sabines became Romans, but Rome became Sabine as well. The women at home. And what of the women? Those once seized became symbols of national unity, a status not devoid of irony. Their marriages, once forced, were now framed as the bedrock of Roman civilization. But behind this narrative was a lived truth. These women bore the weight of dual loyalty. They were daughters of one people, wives of another. Their children had two heritages but only one city. In their households, they instilled hybrid traditions blending dialects, domestic rites, and values. They taught their sons both Sabine restraint and Roman assertiveness. Rome's next generation of citizens, born from abduction, would be Rome's first true mixed children, products of violence, yes, but also of adaptation and survival. The death of Titus Tatius. The fragile peace did not last forever. Sometime after the unification, Titus Tatius was murdered while attending a diplomatic mission in Lavinium. The exact circumstances remain hazy. Some say he was killed in revenge for wrongs committed by his followers. Others suspect political assassination. Romulus, perhaps relieved, did not retaliate. Instead, he allowed the Sabine line to pass quietly into the Roman fold. The joint kingdom ended, but the unity remained. Romulus continued alone as king, now ruling over a more diverse and populous Rome. He honored the Sabine dead, kept their traditions, and maintained their influence. It was a clear message: Rome would absorb, not erase. An enduring story. Over time, the rape of the Sabine women became myth, parable, and political origin story. For the Romans, it became a tale of bold founding, a necessary hardship that birthed greatness. For historians, it remains a moral paradox, a crime that became civics, a trauma that became tradition. For modern eyes, it is a reminder of how violence can be overwritten by narrative but never truly erased. And at the heart of this story is not Romulus nor Titus, but the women, the abducted who made peace, the foreign who became familiar, the voiceless who found a role. They would never be given statues, but their descendants would shape empires. What remains in the landscape? Much of early Rome is long gone, covered by centuries of construction, conquest, and change. But beneath the Forum, beneath the cobblestones and columns, lay the ghosts of that battle between Rome and the Sabines. The Tarpeian Rock still looms, named for the woman whose betrayal allowed the Sabines into the city. The Lapis Niger, a mysterious black stone in the Forum, is said to mark ancient religious rites tied to this era. And the very shape of Roman politics, its absorption of the other, can be traced to this strange moment of marriage by seizure and peace by pleading. Rome did not begin as a city of laws. It began as a city of contradictions. Ending thought. If the foundation of a nation is built on reconciliation after betrayal, can unity born from violence ever become peace that lasts? Memory woven into ritual. In the years and centuries that followed the unification of Rome and the Sabines, the abduction of the Sabine women was not forgotten, it was ritualized. Each year during the Consualia festival, chariot races and public games were held, reminiscent of the original festival that Romulus had used as a trap. Yet now, the event was framed not as an act of violence, but as a celebration of civic origin. The Romans were not in denial of their beginnings. Rather, they wove the discomfort into identity. In this, they were unlike many civilizations of the time. Rather than erase inconvenient foundations, Rome chose to commemorate them. The Sabine women were never named. No individual stories survived, but they were immortalized as a collective force, mothers of Rome, peacemakers by necessity. And so, the private pain of abduction became a public myth of peace, shaping the domestic sphere. In the Roman worldview, the state was made of two distinct but interconnected spheres: the public realm of politics, warfare, and law; the private realm of the home, domus, family, and ritual. The Sabine women, by sheer circumstance, became the first great actors in the private realm of Rome. Their role was not formal, but it was foundational. Through them, Sabine gods and rituals were adopted into Roman domestic worship. Naming customs merged; many Roman names trace back to Sabine origins. Values of resilience, reconciliation, and negotiation entered the Roman domestic code. They raised the generation that would populate the early Roman Senate, fill the army, and build the first temples. Their daughters became brides to the elite, and their sons the first truly Roman citizens. Rome became more than a settlement; it became a society. A lesson repeated through centuries. The story of the Sabine women did not remain confined to early myth. It echoed through Roman history, invoked when the state needed to justify the assimilation of new peoples, the absorption of foreign customs, the use of force for the greater good. When Rome conquered neighboring tribes, provinces, and entire nations, it often offered citizenship, roads, temples, and law in exchange for loyalty. This mirrored Romulus's original invitation to the Sabines: come in peace, or be taken in war, but either way become Roman. And when integration turned tense, the Sabine women's story was cited as proof. Even the fiercest enemies could become family. They became metaphor for Rome's most enduring strength, its ability to absorb rather than destroy. The political legacy of peaceweaving. Later Roman historians such as Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus emphasized the Sabine women not as passive victims, but as active agents of peace. This idea fed into the broader Roman virtue of pietas, duty to family, gods, and the state. These women embodied that triad. They honored their fathers and brothers, yet chose to protect their husbands and children. They maintained rituals that unified two cultures. They preserved the state through personal sacrifice. Though they held no offices, bore no military titles, and delivered no speeches in the forum, they shaped Rome's moral backbone. They were, in essence, the first matriarchs of the Roman conscience. Silence as a legacy. Curiously, despite their importance, the Sabine women remain nameless in all historical accounts. This anonymity, though common for ancient women, is particularly striking here. For these were not just passive figures in the background, they were actors who halted a war and altered a city's course. Yet their silence may have been part of the legacy. In a society that revered order, hierarchy, and lineage, these women left a mark not through monuments, but through generations. They were absorbed into Roman identity, not as individual heroines, but as the quiet force behind the shift from violence to stability. Reimagining the founding myth. Modern readers often recoil at the brutality of the abduction and the uneasy logic that follows, wherein stolen women become wives, and reconciliation masks original trauma. This discomfort is warranted, but it also opens a window into how civilizations confront their contradictions. Rome did not deny its violent origins. Instead, it ritualized and reinterpreted them into a story of unity and pragmatism. In doing so, it taught its citizens that peace often requires compromise, and that identity is forged through shared struggle, even when born of injustice. The Sabine women's story remains Rome's first great lesson in statecraft, not in laws or arms, but in the art of survival through integration. Lasting symbols. The Tarpeian Rock would become a place of punishment for traitors, a symbolic continuation of Tarpeia's betrayal, the maiden who opened Rome's gates. The Forum Romanum, once a battlefield in the Sabine conflict, became Rome's center of civic life, a space where war gave way to debate. The names of Roman gentes, clans, such as Claudius and Valerius, claimed Sabine ancestry, signaling the permanence of their bloodline in Rome's elite. Even the tension between Roman identity and foreign inclusion, so crucial during the Republic and Empire, can trace its lineage to the very moment when a group of women stepped between two armies. Final reflection. If the most powerful stories of empire are born not in conquest, but in the quiet choices of those caught between worlds, whose voices are we still not hearing in the histories we write?